All right, so get ready for a deep dive into a case that I gotta say is both shocking and fascinating. We're headed to Richmond Hill, a seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood in Indianapolis, where a massive explosion one Saturday night in 2012 just completely shattered the peace.
It really is one of those cases where the initial mystery is almost as gripping as the truth itself.
Yeah.
Just picture this. A quiet residential area, families settling in for the weekend, and then suddenly, bam! A blast so powerful it actually registers on a regional earthquake center. I mean, what could cause that kind of devastation?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, was it some freak accident, a plane crash, or maybe even something a bit more sinister? Well, that's what we're going to figure out today, right? We're using an episode of Case File Podcast called Case 140, Richmond Hill, as our guide for this.
And as we really start digging deeper, you're going to see how investigators meticulously piece together all this evidence, ultimately uncovering a really, really twisted web of deceit, greed, and a chillingly calculated plan.
Wow. Okay, so can you paint us a picture of the immediate aftermath of this explosion? I know the podcast mentioned some pretty vivid details that I honestly had to reread a couple of times.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a scene straight out of a disaster movie. Homes were just reduced to piles of rubble, insulation was raining down like snow, and the air was so thick with smoke and this overwhelming smell of gas. Debris was scattered for blocks, and like you said, the sound of that blast, it was heard miles away. Just utter chaos.
It's really hard to even fathom the sheer force of it all. And tragically, this wasn't just about, property damage, right? There were real people caught in the middle of this nightmare.
Oh, 100%.
Go.
Two residents, Dion and Jennifer Longworth, lost their lives in that explosion. Dion was actually trapped in his burning basement calling for help while neighbors frantically tried to rescue him. It's a heartbreaking image, and it really drives home the human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah, it really is. And then on top of that, 12 other residents were injured as well, some with severe burns and broken bones. It really is a stark reminder that behind every investigation, behind every piece of evidence, there are real lives that are changed forever.
It's interesting because those early theories of the plane crash or the bomb, those actually weren't so far-fetched considering the scale of the damage.
Hmm.
But once investigators started, combing through the debris, they quickly realized that the source of the explosion, it was the Shirley residence right next door to the Longworths. And then it became pretty clear that this was no accident.
Okay, so let's shift our focus then to that Shirley residence. What was it about that specific house that tipped investigators off to this possibility of foul play?
Well, there were a few key red flags that popped up pretty early on. So for starters, the gas meter reading, it was astronomically high, indicating a massive amount of gas usage in the weeks leading up to that explosion. It was almost as if someone was intentionally pumping gas into the house.
Oh, wow. That's a chilling thought, like setting the stage for something horrific. And speaking of setting the stage, the podcast also talked about the fireplace, right? What was going on there?
So the fireplace was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It had been modified, and not in a subtle way at all. A vital safety feature, the step-down regulator, that was missing. It'd been replaced with a really simple piece of pipe, which essentially allowed gas to flow freely into the house.
So someone intentionally bypassed important safety measures to create a situation where this house could just fill up with gas. But then how did they ignite it? Was it just the fireplace itself?
That's where this investigation takes a really interesting turn. Remember, this wasn't just a gas leak. This was a huge explosion. The key clue, they found it in the kitchen, actually, the microwave. Its door had been blown off, meaning that pressure had built up inside the appliance before exploding outward.
Wait, so they rigged the microwave to explode?
Not exactly. So the microwave itself, it wasn't the source of that explosion, but it likely played a really important role in the ignition. Remember that massive amount of gas. The house essentially turned into this giant gas chamber. So investigators believe the microwave, with its timer function, it was used to create a spark at a specific time.
So like a delayed ignition? It's almost too calculated, too planned out to believe. All right, so let's talk about the homeowners then. Monzabati Shirley and Mark Leonard. Where were they during all of this?
Get this. They were conveniently 90 miles away at a casino enjoying a weekend getaway while their house was, well, turning into a ticking time bomb.
Okay, wow. That's definitely suspicious. But maybe, just maybe, it was a really terrible coincidence. Maybe they genuinely had no idea that their house was rigged to explode.
Well, that's what they claimed. But as investigators started digging into their backgrounds and their actions before and after the explosion, well, a much different picture started to emerge.
A darker picture.
Let's just say that the story of Monzarati and Mark was anything but a fairy tale.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Let's unpack that story. Let's start with Monserrate Shirley. Who was she, and what was her life like before all of this?
So she had a bit of a Cinderella story, at least at first. She moved to the U.S. from Puerto Rico chasing the American dream, got married, had a daughter, and built her dream home in Richmond Hill. But the fairy tale ended in divorce, and she was left struggling financially.
So, a single mom facing money problems, living in a house that she could barely afford, that's a lot of pressure. And that's when she met Mark Leonard.
Right. Enter Mark, the seemingly charming and successful construction worker. They had a whirlwind romance, and he quickly moved into that Richmond Hill home. But Mark had a hidden side, a past filled with scams, insurance fraud, and even legal troubles.
Not exactly Prince Charming, huh? What kind of scams are we talking about here?
Oh, he was a master manipulator.
Yeah.
Online dating schemes, casino tricks, even faking car accidents to get insurance payouts. And get this, he was actually on house arrest when he met Monserrate, complete with an ankle monitor. Not exactly the stable, reliable partner you'd expect.
Wow. The layers of deception are already piling up here. But what about their actions after the explosion? Did they do anything or say anything that raised any red flags for the investigators?
Well, their story was full of inconsistencies. They claimed they lost everything in the blast, including, get this, a Picasso painting and $20,000 in cash. But investigators noticed there was a strange lack of furniture in the debris. It was almost like their belongings vanished into thin air.
That's odd. And then there's the cat, Snowball. Tell me about that.
So Montserrate's daughter, she had this Persian cat named Snowball. And for 3 weekends in a row, including the weekend of that explosion, Monserrate had boarded the cat. And this was totally out of character for her.
So she removes anything of value from the house, boards her daughter's cat, and then goes gambling for the weekend. It's starting to sound like a pretty carefully constructed alibi, if you ask me.
And it gets even more intriguing when you consider Mark's brother, Bob Leonard. Investigators discovered that Bob had stashed a bunch of items from the Shirley home in his son's basement.
Wait, so they had an accomplice in all of this, and they were storing, potentially incriminating evidence at a relative's house. It seems like they're getting dolder by the minute here.
Right. And remember those drawn blinds and the white van that neighbors reported seeing at the house on the day of the explosion? Those details added even more weight to the idea that this was a well-planned, orchestrated scheme.
And of course, we can't forget about Mark's reputation. People described him as a con artist, someone who knew how to work the system to get what he wanted.
Oh, yeah. And there's actually a really damning piece of evidence. It was a conversation Mark had with a friend about buying a Ferrari. And when his friend asked how he could possibly afford that, Mark bragged about receiving a $300,000 insurance payout after, quote, a freak accident involving his fireplace. The kicker. This conversation happened a week before the explosion.
Oh, wow. He was literally bragging about getting rich off a tragedy that hadn't even happened yet. That's just incredibly disturbing. So it sounds like the pieces are really starting to fall into place here, but obviously there's much more to this story.
Oh, absolutely. What we've uncovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg.
So last time we left off with a mountain of evidence really piling up against Monserrate Shirley and Mark Leonard.
Right.
It was pointing to them as the masterminds behind this horrific explosion. It's almost like something straight out of a true crime novel, except it was all too real.
And those real-life consequences were about to hit hard for, well, everyone involved, really.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, when they were arrested back in December 2012, the news just sent shockwaves through that whole community.
Yeah, it's really hard to grasp the impact that something like this has on a neighborhood. These were their neighbors, people they saw at the grocery store, at school events, and suddenly they're accused of orchestrating this devastating act.
It was a complete betrayal of trust, and the charges against them were incredibly serious. We're talking first-degree murder, arson, conspiracy. They even faced the death penalty at one point.
Wow. The weight of that must have been immense, not just for Monserrate and Mark, but for everyone involved. What was the public reaction like?
I mean, there was definitely a sense of relief, right? Relief that those responsible had been caught. But there was also this overwhelming wave of anger and disbelief. People just couldn't comprehend how anyone could be so callous, so driven by greed, that they would put an entire neighborhood at risk like that.
It's almost unfathomable. I mean, the level of detachment you would need to plan and execute something like this. And my heart just breaks for the families of Dion and Jennifer Longworth, knowing that their loved ones were caught in the crossfire of this whole twisted scheme.
It's hard to even imagine the pain and anguish they went through, and they had to relive the trauma of that night over and over again as the case slowly made its way through the legal system.
Okay, so let's talk about what happened next. Did Monserrati and Mark maintain their innocence? Did they crack under pressure? Or was there something else entirely?
Okay, you won't believe this. Mark, his attempts to cover his tracks, those ended up being his downfall. Remember his cellmate? The one he tried to hire to kill his friend, Mark Duckworth?
Oh, right. He wanted to basically silence anyone who might testify against him. It was a chilling glimpse into his, ruthlessness.
Exactly. But that cellmate? He turned out to be a police informant.
Whoa. Talk about a plot twist. Sounds like he was playing a very dangerous game and definitely underestimated his opponent.
The details of his plan were just shocking. He wanted the hitman to make it look like an accident. He even, suggested specific ways to dispose of the body. He was so desperate to cover his tracks no matter the cost.
It's just a chilling reminder that for some people, self-preservation trumps everything else, even basic human decency.
And those recorded conversations with his cellmate, well, they became key evidence in the case against him. It
Yeah.
was a classic case of getting caught in your own web of deceit.
What about Monserrati? Did she stay loyal to Mark, or did she choose, a different path?
So after a couple of years of legal maneuvering, Monserrati, she struck a deal with the prosecution in 2015.
A plea deal. What did that entail?
So in exchange for dropping the murder charges, she agreed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of conspiracy to commit arson. And, really crucially, she promised to tell the whole truth about the Richmond Hill explosion. She was going to testify against Mark and his brother Bob.
So she became the prosecution's star witness. That must have been a huge risk for her, especially considering Mark's history of manipulation and violence.
Oh, it was a gamble, for sure. But her testimony, it provided this chilling first-hand account of the planning and the execution of this whole horrific plot. She revealed that she knew about Mark's plan from the very beginning. She helped him remove valuables from the house, boarded the cat, and even went along with that casino alibi.
But why? Why would she participate in something so dangerous? Was it purely out of love for Mark, like she claimed?
According to Monserrati, she was terrified of Mark. She said it was a manipulative and abusive relationship. She felt completely trapped and powerless. And she even claimed she loved him so much that she would do anything to make him happy.
Yeah, that's a classic dynamic in abusive relationships, where the victim just feels completely isolated and unable to escape. But, the prosecution, they argued she was more complicit than she was letting on.
Oh, for sure. They pointed to the fact that she got her daughter and cat out of harm's way, but she knowingly left her neighbors to, face the consequences. It raised a lot of questions about the nature of their relationship and just how much she was a victim versus an active participant.
It's a complex situation, no doubt. But her testimony definitely shifted things in the case, providing a crucial insider perspective. And as we'll see, it also brought two more accomplices into the spotlight, Gary Thompson and Glenn Holtz.
Right. Gary Thompson, he was a friend of Mark's. He had experience with insurance fraud. He was supposed to help set the fire during the first attempt, but he got cold feet and just backed out at the last minute. And then there was Glenn Holtz, another associate. He actually tried to talk Mark out of the whole thing, warning him it was way too dangerous.
So even their own friends knew this was a terrible idea, but Mark was just determined to go through with it. It really speaks volumes about his, single-mindedness, his willingness to just disregard the well-being of others.
Yeah, his greed and desperation for money, it seemed to just override any sense of, reason or compassion. He was fixated on that $300,000 insurance payout, no matter what the cost.
So with Monserrati's confession and the evidence against them mounting, what happened to Mark and Bob Leonard? Did they go to trial?
Yes, they both stood trial separately. And it was during Mark's trial that the full extent of his, callous disregard for human life, it really became even more apparent. The families of Dion and Jennifer Longworth, they had their chance to address the court.
Yeah.
And their words were incredibly powerful.
It's hard to imagine, the raw emotion that must have been present in that court when they were finally able to confront the person responsible for this unimaginable loss.
Dion's mother, she spoke about the flashbacks, the nightmares, the absolute agony of losing her son in such a senseless way. She even said she wished that it had been her who died instead. And then Jennifer's father, he spoke about the milestones they'd miss, the grandchildren they would never know, the future that had just been completely stolen from them.
It's just a stark reminder that behind all the legal proceedings, the evidence, the arguments, there are real people whose lives have just been irrevocably shattered. They are the ones that bear the true weight of these acts of greed and malice.
Exactly. And Judge John Marnoka, he acknowledged that when he handed down the sentence. He spoke about the sanctity of the home, how people should feel safe in their own houses, and how Mark Leonard had violated that basic right in just the most egregious way possible.
Wow. So what was the verdict? Was justice served?
The jury found Mark Leonard guilty on all 53 counts against him. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars.
That must have been, at least a small victory for the families of the victims, knowing that he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. But it couldn't possibly erase all the pain that they endured.
No. In Bob Leonard's trial, it followed a similar path. Monserrati testified against him, revealing his chilling indifference to the deaths of Dion and Jennifer. The jury found him guilty on all 51 counts, and he also received 2 life sentences without parole.
What about the other accomplices, Gary Thompson and Glenn Holtz? Did they face any consequences for their roles in all of this?
So Gary Thompson, he struck a plea deal. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison with 10 years suspended. And Bob Leonard, he was furious about the perceived leniency of that deal. He even called a local TV station from prison to complain about it. Glenn Holtz also reached a plea agreement and ended up serving 18 months for his involvement.
So everyone involved faced some form of accountability for their actions. But what about Monserrati? What was her fate?
So as part of her plea deal, she avoided a trial. Instead, she had a sentencing hearing. Her family and her legal team, they pleaded for leniency, arguing that she was under Mark's control and had been manipulated into participating in all of this. But her neighbors, they painted a much different picture. They claimed she was greedy, obsessed with appearances, and willing to do anything to maintain this, facade of wealth.
So it seems like there were two very different versions of Monserrati being presented. How did the judge reconcile those conflicting narratives?
So Judge Sheila Carlisle, she acknowledged the complexity of the situation. But ultimately, she really focused on the fact that Monserrati had just completely betrayed the trust of her community. She had been a mother, a nurse, a neighbor, a friend, and in each of those roles, she had failed, spectacularly.
That's a really harsh but powerful statement. It speaks to just how far-reaching the effects of her actions were and the deep sense of betrayal felt by those who knew her.
Yeah. In the end, Monserrati was sentenced to 50 years in prison. She'll be eligible for parole in December 2032, when she'll be 72 years old.
A tragic end for really everyone involved, but what about the, aftermath for the Richmond Hill community as a whole? How did they even begin to recover from such a devastating event?
It was a long and difficult process. A third of the families moved away from the subdivision. 6 marriages ended in divorce, and many residents reported ongoing, trauma. They struggle with loud noises, flashbacks, just this, lingering sense of unease.
It's easy to overlook the long-term impact of trauma, especially in cases like this where the physical damage is so visible. But the emotional and psychological scars can run so much deeper.
Oh, absolutely. And while nothing can erase the pain and loss caused by the Richmond Hill explosion, there were efforts to honor the memory of those who were, most affected, particularly Dion and Jennifer Longworth.
What kind of efforts? I'm curious to hear how the community chose to remember them. So, welcome back to our deep dive into the Richmond Hill explosion. It's been a pretty heavy journey so far, exploring the depths of human greed and those just devastating consequences that can follow.
Yeah, we've really seen how a seemingly, ordinary neighborhood, just a normal place, became the backdrop for this shocking crime. A crime that shattered lives and left a whole community just reeling.
And as we kind of wrap up our exploration here, I'd like for us to shift our focus a bit to the aftermath. Last time we left off talking about that long road to healing for the folks in Richmond Hill. What did that recovery process even look like?
It was long and complex. Imagine trying to, rebuild your life, rebuild your sense of security in a place where such a horrific event actually happened. It wasn't easy for anyone.
Yeah, the physical rebuilding, that's one thing. But what about the emotional and psychological scars? How did the community cope with all that trauma, the grief, and that lingering fear?
Honestly, there were a lot of challenges. A third of the families actually ended up moving away from the subdivision. They just couldn't escape the memories tied to that place.
Yeah.
And even 6 marriages ended in divorce because couples just struggled to cope with that shared trauma.
It's just a reminder that trauma can have these ripple effects outwards, right? Impacting relationships, families, in ways we might not expect.
Right, and a lot of residents reported ongoing struggles with PTSD. Things like loud noises, unexpected smells, even certain times of day. Those could trigger flashbacks and anxiety. It was like that explosion, even years later, it still had this hold on their lives.
It makes you wonder what kind of support systems were even in place for those who were struggling. Were there resources, I guess, available to help people process the trauma and then actually try to rebuild their lives?
There were some, counseling services available and some community groups organized, like
Yeah.
support meetings and events and things like that. But the need was so immense, and access to proper mental health care
Mhm.
wasn't always easy. It's a common issue after disasters,
Hmm.
where the focus is often on those immediate physical needs and then that long-term psychological impact. It can be kind of overlooked.
Yeah, it highlights how important it is to address trauma in a, I guess, more holistic way, to
Mhm.
provide both practical and emotional support to the people who are actually affected.
Absolutely. And while that road to recovery, I mean, it was long and really arduous, but there were signs of resilience, signs of hope emerging from all that wreckage. The community, they came together in pretty remarkable ways to support each other. They wanted to rebuild their neighborhood and, honor the memory of those who were lost.
It's actually pretty inspiring to see that even with such profound loss like that, the human spirit can still find ways to persevere and to heal. Earlier, you mentioned some of those efforts to commemorate Dion and Jennifer Longworth. Could you tell us a bit more about those?
Oh, yeah. Those efforts were so incredibly touching. Remember Jennifer's dedication to her students? Well, a scholarship was started in her name at the elementary school where she taught. And each year it's awarded to one of her former second grade students when they graduate high school.
That's a beautiful way to keep her legacy alive and really celebrate her passion for education. It's a small act of kindness, but it speaks volumes about, I don't know, just the impact that she had on those around her.
It really does. And then there's Dion's pear tree. That tree, the one he nurtured so carefully. Well, it still stands in their former yard on Fieldfare Way. It's become a symbol of his life, his love for nature and his connection to that community.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of all that destruction, life still finds a way to endure. It's a testament to the resilience of nature and that enduring power of memory.
And in a way, it's a symbol of the Richmond Hill community itself. They were shattered by this tragedy, but they still found a way to rebuild, to grow, and to find beauty, even in the midst of so much pain.
This has been a truly captivating deep dive. We uncovered a shocking crime, explored the kind of the dark side of human nature, and witnessed the resilience of this community when faced with unimaginable loss. But before we wrap up for good here, I want to circle back to that question that we asked at the end of the last part. It's been on my mind, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up. It's a question that deserves more thought.
So, if you could go back in time, like to the days or weeks leading up to that explosion, was there anything that you think could have been done to prevent this whole tragedy? Was there any point where someone could have intervened or spoken up or taken some kind of action that might have changed everything?
Oh, man. It's such a complex question. And there are really no easy answers. On the one hand, it's easy to focus on the individual choices that led to this disaster, like Mark Leonard's greed, his willingness to put other people in danger for his own personal gain. I mean, those were the driving forces behind that explosion. But I think it's also important to consider the systemic factors that might have contributed to his actions. The pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle, the allure of easy money, the lack of accountability that let him kind of operate in the shadows. Those are all issues that deserve, a closer look.
Yeah, it's a reminder that tragedies like this one, they're rarely the result of just a single decision or event. They're usually the result of a bunch of choices, all influenced by both individual and societal factors, really.
And if we want to prevent similar tragedies from happening, we need to address those underlying issues. We need to foster a culture of ethical behavior where greed and deceit aren't rewarded. We need to create, stronger safety nets for those struggling financially so they don't feel pressured to take these like desperate measures. And we need to hold people accountable for their actions so that crimes like this don't go unpunished.
It's a call to action, right? A challenge to look beyond the surface
Right.
and to really address those root causes of these kinds of tragedies.
Yeah. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in creating a safer, more just, and more compassionate society.
Well, this deep dive into the Richmond Hill explosion has been both enlightening and honestly deeply disturbing. It's a story that will stick with me for a long time.
It really is. It's a story that reminds us how fragile life can be, the importance of community, and the enduring power of hope. And it's a story that challenges us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more proactive in trying to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
Well said. And thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope that you'll continue to explore these issues, engage in some meaningful conversations and really strive for a world where tragedies like this just become a thing of the past.